They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but words are important too, right?
Gender matters!
Language forms our interactions with the world in a fundamental way. It goes beyond the use of words to express our inner experience. It is an entirely social phenomenon, and in order to use it, we have to code our thoughts in terms that also have meaning for others.
When we speak and write, we draw on a network of expressions, meanings, and metaphors that target our messages to other users in the same network. The same can be said of images. When we make graphs, for example, we put new information inside a familiar framework that we expect other people to know how to interpret.
The language and images we use connect us to ways of thinking that are comfortable to some people and not others. When we are not aware of this, we risk excluding people based on their race, gender, sexuality, or any other type of identity or social location.
This is really heady stuff. How do language and visual representations relate to gender and sexism in psychology?
Actually, it's pretty concrete. Let's take a look at a couple of examples.
The first and most obvious is gender pronouns. For more than half of psychology's history, masculine grammar was used almost exclusively. This isn't news to you. Think of Abraham Maslow's definition of self-actualization. A musician must make music, an artist must paint, a poet must write, if he is ultimately to be at peace with himself. Do he and himself come out of nowhere to you? Shouldn't it read they and themselves? Anybody can be a musician, artist, or poet, but Maslow's grammar only includes men. Statements like these reinforce associating certain activities with certain genders.
The problem with overgeneralizing male pronouns is that it perpetuates androcentrism. Androcentrism places men, usually white men for that matter, at the center of importance. Research is often done under the assumption that men are the default gender, and that other genders are comparison groups who deviate from the cisgender male norm.
Most researchers would be shocked if they are accused of being androcentric, but that's because it often happens behind the scenes. Something that appears as harmless as gender order in graphs is actually a clue that androcentrism is taking place. There is evidence that putting men before other genders reflects a bias towards seeing cisgender men as the norm and others as deviations. A number of studies have shown that people tend to order groups that have more social power before groups that have less, and to interpret later groups' data as if they were deviations from the baseline group. Females appear on graphs after males, gay people after straight people, black people after white people, and so on.
Androcentrism isn't only expressed through graphs and grammar. The images in textbooks, for example, can also convey androcentrism.
Who do you see represented in the pictures in your textbooks? Earlier this year, our research team looked through pictures in a number of social psychology textbooks and counted the genders and races that were depicted. We found that white men were depicted most of all. Women and people of color were depicted about half as much as white men were. And this isn't a new finding. Other researchers have shown that textbooks not only give cis white men more page time, they also tend to depict women in more traditional domestic roles than in professional ones.
Because of this, textbooks may perpetuate the invisibility of other races and genders in psychology. When women, trans folk, and people of color aren't well represented, we continue to make the same androcentric mistakes, such as wrongly attributing findings from research on cis white men to everyone.
And cultivating work and learning environments that exclude people with other races and genders from wanting to join in.
And finally, let's talk about metaphors. A metaphor is a comparison between two things that aren't literally related, but comparing them highlights similarities that may otherwise be hidden. We encounter lots of them in books or song lyrics, but metaphors are also used in everyday speech and they influence how we theorize in psychology.
Let's look at an example. How about the metaphor that sexual orientation exists on a spectrum? Now, a spectrum is a scale with two extremes, and the points in between are expected to share relatively more properties with the extreme that they're closer to than the one that they're farther from. Sexual orientation has been characterized as a spectrum because people aren't only gay or straight, but have preferences that range from being more attracted to same-sex or opposite-sex individuals.
When Alfred Kinsey first brought the sexual spectrum metaphor to popular attention with the Kinsey scale in the 1940s, it was really progressive. The scale presented a new way for people to think about how sexuality may not be absolute. Same-sex desire is not deviant. because a lot of people experience it to different degrees.
But we have to remember that this is still just a metaphor. People's sexuality cannot be measured in the same way that, say, wavelengths of light can be measured to make the electromagnetic spectrum. Instead, psychologists constructed sexuality as if it could be placed on a spectrum, because it was a convenient way to measure it. We thus have to be willing to change our metaphors when we see that they don't quite fit. For example, where do people who identify as asexual fit on a spectrum? If we hold on to this metaphor too tightly, we may end up missing some experiences that don't fit into it. And the world is way too interesting a place to view it through just one metaphor, don't you think?
Gendered metaphors, images, and expressions are the air we breathe, and we can resist their limitations by asking the right questions.
Is the language you're using or examining reproducing gender stereotypes and promoting a polarized view of gender?
Are your grammatical choices androcentric, or do they promote inclusivity?
If you've identified research that describes gender in polar terms, privileges the normality of one group over another, or relies on an overly restrictive metaphor, can you think of language and imagery that overcomes these limitations?
As always, check out the discussion questions and suggestions for further reading below, and have fun rethinking gender and psychology.
Thanks for checking out our video. Click the link below to explore the rest of the videos in this series.
Also take a look at Psychology's Feminist Voices website for more resources about feminism, gender, intersectionality, and psychology.
Remember, gender matters.